Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So today's video is going to be kind of on the longer side as I split up two different sessions. So I am going to be working in this particular sketchbook as I want to continue making a few more sample drawings to show people what kind of mediums work well on this paper, or just like generic kind of testing and how mediums look on this particular paper regardless. So as you can see, I still have watercolor, gouache, acrylic markers, and just a general kind of swatch overview left to do. So I'm going to go through the ones we did in the past. If you ever want to watch the video on any of the processes of these, I definitely have sketchbook videos on them. I'm blurring this one because I'm going to put this at the very end of today's session as it's not going to be exactly today's main focus. So let's crack open a new page and start with our next medium that I'm going to do samples for, which is going to be watercolors this time. So I'm using this portable kind of watercolor, or like a smaller, more condensed version of a watercolor palette that I usually like to use. So I've been using this one more frequently as my previous palettes are on the larger side and in a different room, so I prefer to keep a smaller one to make it a little bit easier for me to carry it around and not have to worry about space too much on my desk. Next up, we have our sketching materials. So I have the Pilot Color ENO in the color red and a normal mechanical 0.5 HB lead mechanical pencil. So to kind of start off, just because the sketch is going to be more on the simple side, I thought I'll just kick this into time lapse and allow myself to show you pretty much the full session of it. I don't usually spend too much time working on the rough sketch for the most part. This one I kind of regret not spending too much time, as I did end up kind of like shrinking her in a very weird way, and her neck kind of disappears and her face just seems a little bit too like round-ish compared to the rest of like how I typically draw, I guess. And the reason being is the fact that I kind of warped the entire proportionings a little bit due to the perspective of how my sketchbook is laid out. But in terms of the character of who I'm drawing today, I wanted to draw Ina from Hololive, EN, because I haven't drawn fan art of her technically. Oh no, actually I have. I had it in a different video, but I wanted to draw her, I think, most recent new outfit, and it'd just be a good opportunity to use some different colors. And because we're working with watercolors, I did want to choose a character that had a slightly darker color palette, and her new outfit has a good range of both just kind of black and white alongside with her darker hair color. So I thought it'd be just easier for me to show, you know, how much of the paper can take the paint, like the amount of paint and water, I guess, and see if you can see any texture or anything like that. So I have her posed kind of just looking upwards, so her body is going to be more, I guess, like of an up view, or down view? Maybe it's a down view, with her also just munching on a cookie. But I thought this outfit was just super cute, and out of like the Hololive girls, I don't think I talked about my Oshis from Hololive in general, so let's talk a little bit about that as I'm just going to spruce up the sketch a little bit. So I erased the sketch of the like, kind of like the reddish pink color, and I'm going to do a slightly cleaner sketch with the HB Mechanical Pencil so I can see my lines a little bit more clearly and they won't dissolve with the water when we start to paint with the watercolors. But in terms of Hololive EN, my favorites to watch technically has been always Ina. Another one that I tend to watch the most and is also one of my favorites is also MeiLaing, but also I occasionally watch Bales as well. And I think more recently, I'm not sure if I'm gonna say her name wrong, but the Panther type one, Raura, I think is her name. I like a lot of the livers that tend to do a lot more like chatting and art, just because I do like the kind of comfier vibe, and I like learning about like how they draw, and it's just kind of cozy and nice to draw along with other people, which is why I tend to watch more specifically, I guess, like Ina and MeiLaing occasionally. And then in terms of Hollow Stars, I am a little bit sad. If you're following Hollow Stars JP, one of my favorites did end up leaving, I guess. Like I don't really watch Hollow Stars EN as much, so I think there's like 3 livers I watch in JP, and then there are I guess I watch Regis every so often, and then I watch Haka and Octavio every so often as well. It's just like whenever I can catch them, or I just want to watch a VOD or something. I think that's about it in terms of holo. I'm not like super into watching streams as often nowadays just because of the internet connectivity. But let's talk about the painting process. So in the past, whenever I've done any watercolor painting on this particular paper, it does react a little bit differently. And I think that using watercolor paper that either suits your particular style or your actual process is kind of important, as watercolor does react a little bit differently on different watercolor paper alongside with just paper in general. So I've used watercolor on different kind of like sketchbook and notebook paper that were not particularly watercolor paper or any kind of paper that has any sizing in it that allows the paper to kind of like take in the water and absorb in a certain kind of way. But because this is notebook paper, the surface is very smooth, but also very thin. So there's a lot of buckling that you're going to see happening whenever I use a copious amount of water, let's say like the very first wash on her face. And kind of like other layering I'm going to do is going to require more water. But as we start to kind of finish up the painting, I'll be using less and less water and probably darker and more thicker application of the actual paint. So even though, for the most part, watercolor paper will ultimately always have some kind of like tooth to it, definitely watercolor paper that's cold pressed will have a very significant amount of tooth and kind of like a texture. Some other ones will have like texture that's like very uniform, but hot press paper, like even though it is very smooth, it still has some of that fibery paper texture that I think the watercolor adheres nicely to and absorbs, and you can do a bunch of different techniques. But the paper here is definitely not exactly suited for watercolor, and the smoothness definitely makes it a little bit hard to get some even washes, especially initially. So usually, even when I'm working with gouache, I like to lay down a kind of like rough estimate of like different colors alongside with just adding enough color to the page to kind of prime the paper a little bit. Because once I add a kind of like first layer of water or watercolor to the paper, I feel like the paper texture changes ever so slightly and it has a bit of a more toothier texture compared to a very smooth kind of application of the paper. So at least for me, what I find that if the paper is still like fresh and clean, the watercolor lays down quite nicely, but still is kind of patchy, and because of how the paper buckles, it might leave a little bit more pooling of color in certain areas. But occasionally, if you're like flipping through your sketchbook and you decide to use watercolor, so maybe the natural oils in your hands, or if you're like me, I apply hand cream a lot because my hands are dry, you might transfer that to your paper, and occasionally those oils or like cream or whatever is gonna act kind of like a barrier on top of your paper. So luckily for the piece that I'm doing of Ina, I didn't really run into that problem. I did try my best to make sure that I was kind of keeping my hands as clean as possible. But for the initial washes, pretty okay in terms of like getting a flat wash for the most part. I definitely find that being able to mix colors and letting them bleed becomes a little bit more difficult and not as seamless compared to having the significant amount of dry time compared to actual like watercolor paper. But for the most part, had a lot of fun working in this kind of particular way. I think in the past when I used watercolor in this kind of like notebook paper, I've always either did watercolor as like a last minute decision. So oftentimes, like I said, my grubby hands kind of get on the paper, so natural oils will transfer. So I always get more like splotchy and very kind of uneven washes. But I also think I don't really take my time in terms of painting when I work in my notebook or sketchbook, just because I do treat it more like a sketch. But in terms of like showing for samples, I wanted to try my hardest and try my best to make sure that it's kind of more of giving like my all in terms of trying with the medium, so that you can kind of see that this potentially is like what you can do at best, or or at least like a good representation, if anything. So while I'm working on Ina, you can kind of see that I'm testing a little bit. So I'm going back and forth and adding some darker colors to kind of like the upper portion of the crown of her head, just because I wanted that intense color, as Ina's hair is on the slightly darker side. It's kind of like a dark purpley black almost. But I had some leftover paint and I didn't really want to saturate my brush with more water, so I decided to bring some of that darker color back into the underside of her hair and just do a little bit of lining so that we can see if I can get good enough control in terms of using the watercolors here. I also tried my best to not use any extra materials for the line work. So once we are finished with like kind of the washes and the initial shading and everything, when I want to do the line work, I will be just using a kind of higher concentration of pigment versus water. This way I can get a nice dark crisp line without having to worry about water kind of making the line super thick or splotching somewhere else or bleeding into other colors. But for the most part also, I found that a lot of the color doesn't really get lifted once placed down onto this paper. So it's a little bit less forgiving if you're trying to maybe blot out some color from the paper. I'm sure if you're blotting color, it might be slightly easier, but if you're intending to mix your color while it's already dry, it probably will be harder to budge. So definitely try to keep that in mind. If you want to let colors flow from one color to another, it's best to probably at least connect two wet edges or just do wet on wet to kind of get that gradient. I was like trying to figure out whether or not this paper was going to have some strange texture, because like I said, it's been a little bit since I've done watercolor in this kind of like on this kind of paper, I guess. So I was trying to see if there was like any significant amount of like pilling or anything, but for the most part, as long as you let your initial layers dry first, there is probably no pilling at all, I found. And luckily none of my pigments for my colors have any of that granulation, so that it's not really simulating anything weird in terms of the texture of the paper. So hopefully it's a good overview of what kind of watercolor looks like on this particular notebook paper. I definitely found myself that I kind of want to do more painting very soon. I definitely will probably dabble into it again once the convention is over, so probably like closer to mid-August or something, just because I want to take my time and just paint a larger piece, because I definitely took my time while working on Ina, even though her face is kind of botched in terms of like proportioning to the rest of her body and all that. I still had a lot of fun just playing around with the paints and allowing myself to get kind of used to using watercolors again. I definitely think that my brushwork is a little bit rusty. I don't know if it's because I was rushing when doing the initial washes, but some of my lines were a little bit shaky, and when I was doing the line art, it did give me a little bit of a hard time. But like I said, it might be also because of the way the paper takes the paint and water. So I don't know, it might be both in this case. But I definitely had a lot of fun just working on this, and hopefully we'll paint more in the future. And probably next week I will be doing gouache. So we'll probably go through this process once again, since I'd like to do a kind of watercolor wash over top of my sketch before we paint with gouache, just for initial planning sake, and like I said, priming the paper a little bit so that my gouache has something nice to kind of grip onto. And then last but not least, I will do the acrylic markers on this paper alongside with the probably like pen, ink, other material kind of swatches, since I will have probably all the materials with me at the time. But with that being kind of scheduled for next week, hopefully I will have the final page for my sketchbook, but not the one I'm currently working on, but my usual sketchbook that you kind of see for these videos, like the blue baby's breath one. And then I will have a sketchbook tour at some point alongside with the kind of like unveiling of the new notebooks, which you would have saw if you watched, I think, last Monday's video, I believe. Probably. And then after that, we can go on a kind of like new adventure in a different sketchbook. So hopefully that will be the case. time for kind of the most nerve-wracking part of whenever I do watercolor illustrations like this in particular, is doing the line work. So to me, it is the most satisfying part because I like adding line art at the very end to kind of like tie the entire illustration together. But it is a little bit nerve-wracking, and I feel like for some reason I did not tackle the face first, while I usually like to tackle the face first so that I can know if I'm going to regret spending all this time on the surrounding areas just to dislike the face. But for the most part, if I mess up the line work, sometimes I will like panic and just try to blot things out. If not, I'll try to make things work. You can kind of see that this part had too much water, so I kind of changed it more to a shadow rather than having it as like a very thick line of line work. So hopefully we're just rolling with the punches here and making sure things look a little bit more on the clean side and not too botched for the most part. But I think with the line work, and I think there's just a few places I want to do like some small touch-ups, I think the painting of Ina is pretty much finished. And yeah, this just gave me a very big like urge and kind of push to wanting to plan a larger illustration, maybe of Masaki or Kaisen or something, or Sato in the future, or like something. I will plan something because I pushed a lot of things onto the back burner ever since like the beginning of this year. So I'll kind of dig up some of those maybe in the future. Oh yeah, last thing. I ended up using a little bit of the metallic paints that came in this particular little watercolor set as kind of a way to fill up the background a little bit. So I added the little sparkles just because I thought it would be cute, and it looks kind of nice with the gold shimmer. But it's kind of like a cop-out way so I don't have to do a larger fill in the background and make it look all splotchy and pick a color that might not fit. Here's kind of a little close-up, and it's not the cleanest, but I think it's a lot nicer compared to some of the other watercolor paintings that I've done on this particular paper. So here we have little Ina in her very cute kind of like cooking, baking outfit, which I adore so much because I think she's like one of the cutest people ever. So yeah, here's Ina. I'm trying to show you guys the kind of metallic look of the sparkles. But let's move on to our next little session, I guess you can say. So I filmed this like 3-ish weeks ago, maybe. I think it's like at the beginning of July. And I was going to use it as backup footage, but I found it a little bit easier for me to group up the materials and I guess like what is the word I'm looking for? Medium. So I wanted to group up some of the mediums together so I'm not doing just one medium per video. So even though the main focus was supposed to be the painting with watercolors on this notebook paper, I decided to slide in this footage that I filmed weeks ago of me doing water-based markers on this notebook paper. I don't think it's too bad of me adding this in at kind of like the very tail end of the video, just because I've done this particular method so often, I feel like. So as usual, I am doing the rough sketch with the Pilot Color ENO in the color red, and this time we're not going to do a tight sketch or a cleaner sketch. So we are going to be using this particular sketch directly, and I am drawing Mint Phantome, which is one of my favorite VTubers. I've talked about her a little bit in the past, I think. So she has a super cute design and a color palette I found slightly difficult to not make it look too monochromatic. So she has a lot of just mint white, and I think it's got a little bit of brown. She also has blue and yellow here and there for like little accent colors. Bringing out the sketchbook that has all my swatches, I went ahead and picked about, I think it's like five colors right here. We're gonna use probably more or less like 2 of them as like the main color. I'm going to use pink to help fill in some of the shadows for her skin tone. And then we have yellow and a kind of like mid-tone-ish blue. I guess like maybe leaning on the lighter side as kind of some accent colors to help fill out her color palette. But technically, if I really wanted to, I would have limited this color palette to probably 3 colors. So probably the pink, the mint, and a brown, because brown will be our darkest color and I'll be using that for the line art a little bit later. So in terms of like the result of the sketchbook So I was gonna say spread, but it's not a spread, it's a single page. But the particular little sketch or little demonstration sample that I'm doing right now, I think it's been a little bit since I've actually really liked one of my water-based marker doodles. More recently, whenever I use water-based markers to kind of fill in colors and then do line work on top, like I said, I think I'm becoming more impatient and just rushing a lot of things. So when I'm placing down the initial colors, like I'm doing right here, I've been applying them very rushed and very rough, while for the one that I'm doing of mint, I'm kind of making sure things make a little bit more sense and trying to fill them out a little bit more cleanly compared to before. So you can see that because of the color palette is going to be a little bit more heavily on white and mint, I'm trying to bleed in the yellow more by putting it in the background. I've also placed a little bit of the yellow into kind of the highlight of where the crown of her hair is, and I'm gonna add a little bit of the pink there too a little bit later. But moving on to the part that I like to do most in terms of tying everything together, which is kind of the line art process. So went ahead, chose a kind of dark brown for the most part, and I am using the fine liner side instead of the brush tip side. So if you're not familiar with these markers, I do like using them because they have a brush tip on one end, which is great for filling in flats in larger areas. And I don't know, it's just a lot easier for me to do rough kind of coloring or just filling in larger areas like this. While the other side has a kind of like firmer nib, similar to a fine liner. But because they're in the same kind of like pen, it does have the same amount of color variety as the brush tip size. So it makes it a little bit easier for me to just carry around a few pens and we can get some really nice color palettes kind of going alongside with not really needing to carry around too many supplies at once. So for the most part, I think the line arting process was quite fun for this particular one. I did end up spending a lot more time just kind of pretty much following the lines that I can see of my sketch. Here and there, I will be adding a little bit more line width variation to create a little bit of depth, especially in her hair. I add a little bit of hatching here and there. There's like a little bit of texture in her eyes. The hatching can be found more in her hair just to kind of create more depth as well. And then I think for the most part, brown is kind of present in her color palette. I don't have a picture of her like on me right now, so I'm not going to be looking as closely, but I think I chose brown because it is present in her color palette, and if I use it as a line art color, it can kind of fill in as the darkest color. So pretend if Mint had black in her color palette and I wanted to keep it as a softer look, I could have chose a dark blue, I could choose a dark green, or even just the dark brown that I'm using and kind of fill it in a little bit more condensed in terms of like hatching or anything like that, and it will still read kind of more in terms of values as black for the most part. So usually when I'm choosing colors, value is going to be important if I want to keep my color palette very minimal. So let's say I'm doing 3 colors or even just like 2 colors. It's nice to have a darker color and a lighter color, or a lighter color and a mid-tone color, just to keep things easier to differentiate a little bit visually. But also I like to make sure there is a suitable color for their skin tone. So I like to choose something on the warmer side, and then everything else can either complement it, or I can go the exact opposite and go like darker and cooler. So it's just kind of like preferences in terms of choosing colors. But in this case, I've also allowed myself to use a lot of the yellow because it wasn't super present in terms of like her kind of highlights of her hair, or like the shadow of her hair and the little kind of X clip on her hair as well. So it just makes it a little bit easier for me to balance if I put yellow into the background, because I did have a slight inkling that I could have used pink instead, but I did like yellow a little bit more, and I think pink is a little bit more present compared to the yellow in terms of where I placed it. But you can kind of see that everywhere else is pretty much just white and mint for the most part, so it looks a little sparse. But some of the areas I will be just kind of shading in with the brown so that we can still keep our intensity with the line art, but not take away from some of the values that is needed for some other areas, such as the ribbon. I'm trying to think what else I wanted to kind of like update you guys on. I think not too much. I think it's about 2.5 weeks until Animathon, so I'm still I was gonna say I'm still in crunch mode for the convention, which I technically am, but I'm treating it a little bit leisurely because I did do the majority of the bulk of con prepping for the K-pop market initially. So I'm treating it a little bit more lax, but I'm sure in the next coming weeks I am probably gonna go into panic mode and start to really regret my decision of being a little bit lax this month. But hopefully August will be like full on, just fully indulging in all the art projects and stuff that I want to work on. And there's a few things I want to work in terms of another shop update, which hopefully will be in the winter. So just kind of like a mini heads up, I will be doing a shop update in the middle of August after the convention, and at that time I will have all my sticker stuff as usual, prints alongside with the new notebooks. So please look forward to that if you're looking out for any notebook designs. But for most part, I think today's little drawing session is done. I ended up finishing up Mint, and we finished up Ina as well. And I think that's pretty much it. So I'm just gonna write a little bit of text at the very bottom, giving indication of who I drew for the particular medium. So I'm putting Ina's name at the bottom. I already did Mint's from a previous session. Yeah, I think both of them turned out pretty cute. I think I like the one of Mint a little bit more just because the proportionings of Ina is very whack because her neck is gone. We have my OC Kaisen in pencil, we have Ritsu in colored pencils, and then we have Kaya in alcohol markers. So I still have gouache and acrylic markers, and hopefully I can decide who I'm gonna draw for each of those little sample pages. But I think that's it for today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video. Bye!